All right, so I have the pleasure of introducing the Honorable Muriel Bowser, who has served as the mayor of the District of Columbia for 5 years, and her entire bio is available for you in the packet. But let me focus on her expertise in housing. Mayor Bowser considers affordable housing as the primary focus of her administration. The primary focus of her administration. This is really thrilling. And she often summarizes housing as providing pathways to the middle class, which is a key theme in some of the recent reports she's released. Her efforts have included putting $100 million each year in the district's Housing Production Trust Fund. And with that, the city has helped fund dozens of affordable housing projects. And she's committed to sharply increasing the low-cost housing in some of the district's most affluent neighborhoods to create housing opportunities throughout the city. And last year, Mayor Bowser chaired the National League of Cities Task Force on Housing, which developed platform recommendations for local and national solutions. As mayor, she doubled the district's annual investment in affordable housing and has set a bold goal to build 36,000 new homes by 2025. I'm excited to get a chance to sit down and talk with her about her plans. Please help me welcome the Honorable Muriel Bowser.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you and welcome.
Do we have to trade off the microphone, or am I sitting on one too? Okay. So I was just telling the crowd here that I started doing housing research about 20 years ago, and never imagined that I'd be at the National Press Club with the National Association of Realtors and the mayor of Washington, D.C., at a summit on affordable housing policy. So this is just an unbelievable time and a real honor to be able to be here and to talk about this.
Well, thank you. I never thought I'd be the mayor of Washington, D.C. 20 years ago, talking about affordable housing at the National Press Club. But I am honored to have the opportunity to represent 700,000 Americans across 8 wards in Washington, D.C., who are very proud of our progress, for sure, but also very anxious to make sure that we get our policies right so that more Washingtonians can live in our town.
Oh yeah, I look forward to unpacking that a little bit. As the chair of the National League of Cities Housing Task Force, which is it's an extraordinary report. I recommend. I learned a lot about places all around the country. Different cities have different housing and labor markets. Can you speak a little bit to that range of what you saw for those cities and some of their affordable housing plans, and then talk a little more about what you plan to do here in DC?
Well, absolutely, and I was very happy to be tasked by our then president, Karen Wilson Freeman, to lead the task force. And the National League of Cities are elected officials, appointed officials from towns big and small, bipartisan mayors, council members, planning directors, housing directors, you name it. People coming together on a range of issues. And part of our job is education, and part of our job is advocating with the federal government for what we need. And so that discussion really spans every issue. For us, it's housing affordability. For Gary, Indiana, and the heartland cities and towns, it's vacancy. For cities out west and all over the nation, and in every city that needs more housing, is homelessness. So all of those issues were on the table. And so one thrust of the report is cities and towns. We can do a lot on our own, but if the federal government was truly doing its part, we could get get a lot more accomplished. And advancing that agenda, the U.S. Conference of Mayors has done so as well, to the 2020 stage is part of our work now. And one very, very big item that's come out, and I was very happy to see Mike Bloomberg advance it, and I hope everybody starts talking about it, is if the federal government was providing vouchers, guaranteed federal assistance for families at 30% and below of the AMI. That would mean that they would have guaranteed housing, and cities and towns like ours could focus on building all of the units that would be required to support that through workforce, all the way through to market rate units. And that's what it's going to take, that type of commitment from the federal government.
Yeah, you mentioned there's a strong thrust around addressing the crisis of affordable housing at the national level, and vouchers are one of the things that the group talks about. Can you say a little more about other kinds of things the federal government could do to address affordable housing?
Well, I think another thing that we have very much focused on in D.C. is keeping people from emergency situations and out of our homeless system. And our focus has been looking at the whole continuum of housing need, from people who are having emergencies and need shelter. We have can talk to you forever about what we've done in family homelessness and what we will do for unaccompanied adults in our homeless system, to making sure we're preventing them from getting in the system at all, and that's with emergency funding. We know how many people, how many families in our city don't have $400 in the bank. We know how many people in our nation don't have $400 in the bank. So just imagine that could be a few missed days of work, an illness, a car breaking down, an appliance breaking down at home. Any of those things could spin your family into a very serious crisis. So we know if we can support families before they have those emergencies, we can keep them in safe and affordable housing. And that's part of the strategy that we're focused on. We also know, you mentioned our commitment to local funding and funding gaps for building new units. And we've had a tool in the district, I guess it's probably been 15 years, and maybe a little bit older than 15 years old, our Housing Production Trust Fund, where we use a portion of our deed and recordation taxes, thank you realtors, for making sure that part of our economy continues to churn. But we take a portion of that, it's dedicated to our Housing Production Trust Fund. And it's volatile. Some years it's could be one level, and other years higher or lower. When I became mayor, we were spending about $50 million out of our HPTF. We were dedicating $50 million a year to our HPTF. And I committed then that I would double that from our general funds and spend at least $100 million, and that's what we've been doing. Because we've been consistent, what our development partners tell us, both for-profit and nonprofit development, is that they've built their capacity and they're ready to do more units because they know the city's going to be there. And so we have thusly created more demand for HPTF, which means more units can be built. And now we need to put more money in the HPTF. So it's a ongoing negotiation in the district.
Yeah, the $400 margin that can be the difference between being housed or not. It seems small, and when before you arrived, I was talking a bit about the consequences of housing, rent burden and instability in housing quality, and it ends up costing a lot more in the long run to not securely house families and children. And I'm wondering, if we were able to achieve some of these affordability goals, what other kinds of priorities could be addressed for the people of DC and elsewhere? I mean, that's, I think, a big part of trying to get support for this kind of policy.
Absolutely. Well, we know, and our philosophy is housing first, and I think some of the biggest we know off the bat would be people would be healthier. They would be better able to find jobs and to have the types of jobs that sustain their families, and children would do better in school. I mean, those are just kind of three off the top that we know when people can if you don't have a roof over your head, sadly, it's raining. I've just passed somebody that had a umbrella over a bus stop, and they were under it. And just so you know, if that is your everyday 24-hour experience, you may not be able to get clean and sober or focus on mental health, or certainly not get a job.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, to those of us who are spending time with families, this seems so clear. Mm-hmm. But I think, being able to get support for affordability is still, something, is certainly growing, but I think the fight is not over.
Well, I think another thing that helps is that sometimes we talk about affordability as it's just a problem for the homeless, mm-hmm. or it's just an issue if you have 30%, or you have a low income. And what we learned, and what I've known all along, but the Washington Post did a poll last fall. And I think it surprised some people, because not only did it say that housing affordability was the number one issue for Washingtonians, it said it was a number one issue for Washingtonians with incomes all the way up through $200,000 of household income. So people of all incomes are concerned about how much housing costs and what it's taking away from all of the other things they want to do in their lives.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is sort of echoing this theme as, housing as a cornerstone for family, human development, potential. And I'm curious, it sounds like your team did a lot of work in communities and did a number of events around the housing equity issues. And can you talk a little bit about what those events were like and what you heard from across the district?
Well, housing equity is a huge issue, and it's part of our acknowledging that the state of housing, and not just in our city, but cities all over the U.S., has been influenced by some policies that us today in 2020 aren't proud of. So you go in cities and towns across America, and they're segregated by race. You look at schools, and they're segregated because the housing's segregated. You look at black home ownership compared to white home ownership and what that means for individual wealth acquisition, and that really tells us the story of America. So we, in getting to 36,000 units and being intentional about that policy, are we able to mitigate any of the effects of those many, many decades of discriminatory housing policies? It's not a light conversation, right. And it's not one, and it could make us sound like we're accusing people of dastardly things when they just want to buy a house on a tree-lined street. Mm-hmm. And that's not what we intend. But it also, it makes communities defensive. So what we want to do is just have an honest conversation and put the government to the private housing community, local communities and their elected leaders and representatives in the best position to have conversations about real units. One thing that has always concerned me is that if you put a big goal out there, we're going to have 36,000 units. People's imaginations will imagine the absolute worst, like those 36,000 units are going to tower over their backyard, mm-hmm. or into their bathroom, or their school is going to be, all these things. And, reasonable, rational people have these thoughts. So what do we do to give them the type of information that they need? So 36,000 is a big number for a town like ours, but if you just slice it up, it becomes more manageable. So we broke down our city into 10 planning areas that we use for a number of things. And I asked my economic development office and my planning office to say, given the density, the zoning, and the opportunity in these 10 planning areas, how many units can be absorbed here? And we're going to set that as a goal. And we're going to assign that goal to that planning area. So every part of the city is a part of the solution. And then I'm going to go out to the private development community and say, this is what we need. And I'm going to go out to all of the folks that are putting together the capital for affordable housing and say, this is what we need. Give us your ideas. And then I'm going out to neighborhoods and saying, this is what you have to support. Let's figure out a way to do it together and make these units attractive units that are sustainable, that fit into the neighborhood and can be a fabric of the community. And then I think we can get there.
Yeah, you're tying a lot of different threads together. In the neighborhood by neighborhood plans were really interesting. And you mentioned racial segregation, and you mentioned sort of fair share across the report. And I'm wondering if you could say a little more about the how you came to those neighborhood goals and how you hope to increase equity and affordability at the same time through those goals.
Well, we came to it, as I mentioned, the whole region we know has a gap in terms of the number of people who want to live here and the housing we need through, I think the COG did it through 2030, I think. And we looked at what the region's gap was and what our share of that regional gap would be. And that's how we got to the top line, the 36,000. And looking across the neighborhoods, we looked at what was available on our current zoning, what we're proposing, and what we know about the corridors and what could be built there. And these are realistic numbers. They're not pie in the sky numbers. We can get there.
Which I think is, when I saw the map, it was just stunning and bold and really exciting. I live in Baltimore, and there. It's always conversation about fears of gentrification in Baltimore, right? I think the story's complicated, and often, DC is brought up as a comparison, and we know that gentrification can be thrown around as a word that means lots of different things. But we also know that we need development, and we need amenities, and we need different kinds of things to serve many of our residents. But then there's the concern people have about displacement, and just talk to us a little bit about how we should be thinking about that here.
Well, I've always had the approach that neighborhoods have to improve. Nothing stays the same. It gets better or it declines. And so how do you make the types of investments in communities that people of all backgrounds and incomes need and want? I don't care where you live. You want a great school. You want safe transportation options. You want a grocery store. You want a library. You want recreation. No matter where you live, you want those things. No matter who you are, you want those things for your families. And so we have to go in and make those types of investments. I think there were certainly some lessons learned in our city. One of my predecessors, Tony Williams, had the goal of attracting 100,000 new Washingtonians. That was probably back in the late 90s, 100,000 new Washingtonians. People thought he was insane. And we have attracted more than 100,000 new Washingtonians. So Washington is now over 700,000. Then we were probably 550, 535 in that range. And so what does that mean? That means that we can make the types of human services investments and school investments, and parks and recreation investments that other towns wish they could make. It has also meant that, it's estimated that 20,000 African Americans who lived in the city then don't live in the city now. And so what could we have done to make sure that people had access to first-time home buyer programs? Were there things that we should have done with taxes on properties? Were there things that we could have better done to protect generational transfer of homes from one family member to the next? Probably. And that would be my advice to other cities who are making big investments in attracting higher income people to their city. It's not that we don't want high income people in Washington, because we do. We want everybody to be able to live in Washington. So what we are doing and we're called on to do moving forward is making sure that we have family size units, that we're looking out for 30% and below, that we are making sure that everybody has the ability to buy a home who wants to buy a home in DC, and making more DC neighborhoods attractive, that they have all of those things that I just mentioned: great school, great transportation, grocery, because that's what we know a lot of people, African American and otherwise, have left the city looking for in other communities.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense, and that's a type of out-migration. But, in terms of some of the concerns that come up over and over again, in cities around the displacement because of increasing costs, I know you probably hear about this all day long. Talk to us a little bit about what can be done for families who, are being displaced in DC. Sort of how does the affordability plan and some of the policies speak to that?
Well, I'll give you one of many examples of programs that we're working on, but our government employs 37,000 people, okay, who work for DC government. About half of them live in Washington, DC, which means the other half does not. And they all have great incomes, job security, they have great benefits. They should live in Washington, D.C. That's just how I approach it. So even if we were able to retain more of our own workforce, we would see more Native Washingtonians staying in Washington, D.C. And so one program that we've created is around home buyership for our own employees, home ownership. We have a relationship with a bank who gives them special rate and programs. We have our own down payment assistance program, and we see more and more of our employees taking advantage of home ownership in Washington, D.C. So that's one example. We're also very focused on our teachers, and we're working with a national program now to help more of our teachers stay in Washington, D.C. And then we continue because if we think that gentrification or displacement is an issue just about housing, it's not. It's also about wages and employment, right, and career paths to sustainable jobs. And so we have spent 5 years trying to raise wages of D.C. residents, including increasing our minimum wage to $15 an hour, which we will get to this July. We've been on a 4-year path to get there, and we will be there. We have started an infrastructure academy. We're looking at all of the high demand fields where we know that there are jobs available and they pay really DC life-sustaining wages. And we know that that's an infrastructure. We have so many infrastructure jobs that go unfilled in this region, and we want to make sure our folks are in it. Cybersecurity is a growing field, and tech is a growing field. But lastly, an area that our traditional kind of education system has neglected, in my view, is how do we help people thinking about having their own businesses? And there's a lot of people who haven't made it in traditional work or traditional higher ed, but they are entrepreneurial by nature and spirit. And if we cultivate that and help them with startup processes and regulations and some capital, they can turn their business ideas into businesses. And we're having some early success with that.
This is an exciting agenda, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, sort of about two questions that are maybe overarching. One is, the biggest challenge you face in accomplishing your most important goals, but then what makes you really optimistic about them?
The biggest challenge that we face is, and everybody in this room knows, affordable housing projects are hard. They're complicated and they take a long time. And so I think the toughest challenge is keeping the level of urgency and hitting targets. I'm optimistic because I know it can be done in chunks. I know we have the resources and the political will to do it. And so I would say that in our city, we're lucky because it's like 14 of us that make the decisions. So I get to be a mayor of the best city in the world, but I have a 13-member council, and we're largely ideologically similar, especially on this issue of affordable housing. So having the idea, we work with our council members for support, but I don't have to convince them that doing affordable housing is what we need. Maybe how much, and how much is going to take each budget cycle, but we largely support affordable housing for our city. So that's the big thing. But I would say for us, what are the new tools and innovations in this space that's going to allow us to be most successful? Are there different financing mechanisms that are going to make this easier? There are different building materials. Are there more things that we can do with zoning and regulation that makes this easier? But for us, I think about what we need and how the cost just keeps going up and the time to get it done doesn't go down. So that's what probably concerns me the most, because if we could solve some of those inputs into delivering affordable housing, I think we could be more successful. But we're still out there. Somebody has the big idea with construction or the big idea with finance, and we still need it.
I'm wondering if anyone in the room feels that they might have some of those answers. So how am I doing on time? Do we want to open up for?
No.
We're good? We're good on time?
No.
Okay, great. So I think that the one of the last questions that I have is trying to figure out how to juggle a couple of challenging priorities, right? So we want to accomplish fair housing, equal access, in real housing choice for families, while being able to also provide some of these growth goals. And I think sort of how do you balance that? Those sort of sometimes I think complementary, but sometimes also competing aims.
Say a little bit more about that.
So I think there's been a theme a bit about the question of segregation, the question of fair housing, which sort of underlies, as you mentioned earlier, some of the inequality here in DC and other cities. And so how do you address that while also trying to address affordability and growth and different kinds of places? Because certainly is and you mentioned the sort of history. I'm assuming you're referring somewhat to redlining and other kinds of historical practices that really undergird a lot of what we still see. And sort of how do we do some of these things in tandem to ensure fair housing while ensuring some of these other goals?
Well, I think you have to have solid planning that is based in what the city needs to get done. And the real advantage that mayors have is that we can speak to a citywide goal and galvanize support behind that citywide goal and go out into communities and talk about it. My team has planned a really innovative series of community discussions, and where we're just going out and lay it on the line. We're showing a pretty provocative, thought-provoking video about the history of how we got here with housing policies, laying out what the goals are, and explaining how we think that we can get there. But it's not a blaming session. It's just that this is what we need to do for the whole city. And my experience has been that if you kind of lay out that citywide goal, get a lot of support around it, we have an experience here with closing down family homeless shelter that was, in our view, deplorable and not fit for families who were in emergencies, over 400 people in an old hospital. And the strategy that we used to shut it down was to replace the units with smaller units, 50-unit buildings in every ward in the city, all across the city. And so in doing that, we promoted the principle that every part of the city is going to be a part of the solution. Nobody can say, you're dumping a shelter on me because we're planning beautiful short-term family housing everywhere. And I really feel that when we have, if people feel like they're not being targeted or overburdened, but we can share with them how they're being a part of a larger citywide solution to something everybody says they want a solution for, then that's really our charge, and it's pretty exciting. It's hard work, but that's why they hired us.
Yeah, that is really exciting. And if I'm just curious, and part of it is because I'm a field worker. Can you say a little more about the community events and some of the, the response to having the sort of shared goals and also shared responsibility for some of this? And reading the report, it was really inspiring to see some of the residents' quotes.
Sure. So we will actually, I think I'll be at one in a couple of weeks. My team did one a couple of weeks ago. That I didn't attend, but I got a lot of feedback from. So I think people are excited to talk about it. They don't. People want to make sure they're heard without being felt like they're being blamed, and that's just real life conversation. And so what I told one of my team is we would be wrong, and it would be a big mistake for our process if we walked into every community meeting and said, you're a NIMBY. Because maybe they are, but maybe they have some legitimate fears and concerns that if we listen to, we can overcome. So that's our approach.
Yes, well, with that, help me thank Mayor Bowser for spending time with us. This is really exciting. Thank you so much.